The fluorescent lights of the Ellison and Company headquarters cast a sterile glow across the polished marble floors. The building, a towering symbol of power and prestige, held stories within its glass and steel facade that many would never know. To the outside world, it was a testament to success. Inside, it was a different reality for John Parker, the humble janitor who walked its halls unnoticed. John was in his early 40s, with a weathered face that bore the lines of years spent in quiet observation. His bald head, marked by the subtle shine of overhead lights, hinted at the challenges he had faced. Where hair once grew thick and dark, now only the bare skin remained, emphasizing his worn cap that he often wore as part of his uniform. As he pushed his mop bucket through the empty corridors late at night, the world around him seemed frozen in time. Each swipe of the mop echoed through the silence, a rhythmic reminder of his invisibility. He was a fixture in the building, always there, always ignored. Executives in tailored suits passed him without so much as a glance. To them, he was not John Parker, the man with stories of resilience and quiet strength, but merely the janitor. But John's sharp eyes and keen mind caught everything. He knew the faces, the routines, the whispered conversations that lingered behind closed doors. He knew secrets he shouldn't. One night, as the city outside pulsed with lights and the distant hum of traffic, John's routine was interrupted. While mopping the hallway outside the 21st floor conference room, he heard voices, urgent, clipped, and laced with tension. The door was ajar, just enough for sound to escape. He glanced around to make sure the floor was empty, then edged closer, his heart pounding with a sense of foreboding. "We have no choice, Mark," a voice said, deep and assertive. "If we don't avert the funds now, we'll face ruin." John's brows knitted. It was Mark Ellison, the charismatic vice president known for his silver tongue and ruthless ambition. Mark was admired, feared, and untouchable. The voice responding to him was softer, hesitant. John recognized it as belonging to Claire Bennett, the finance director, a woman of integrity who had always seemed conflicted. "Mark, this isn't just a financial maneuver. We're talking about thousands of people's lives, people who trust this company," Claire said, her voice strained with moral conflict. A pause. The kind of pause that makes the air heavy with unsaid truths. John leaned in, holding his breath, his hand gripping the mop handle tightly. "They'll never know," Mark said, his tone cold and final. "We move the funds, secure our positions, and by the time anyone notices, we'll be untouchable." John's chest tightened as if an iron band had been wrapped around it. The words echoed in his mind. Move the funds, secure our positions. The implications were chilling. This wasn't just a misstep in accounting. This was a deliberate act of greed that could strip thousands of employees of their financial security. He took a shaky step back, mind racing. What could he do? He was a janitor, a ghost in the machine of this massive corporation. Yet, the weight of what he had just learned made it impossible for him to stay silent. He needed to act, but how could he, a man no one saw or heard, challenge someone as powerful as Mark Ellison? The door creaked slightly, snapping John out of his daze. He darted back to his mop, pretending to be absorbed in cleaning as Mark stepped out, his expression smug, eyes flicking past John without recognition. Claire followed a moment later, her gaze meeting John's briefly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before she looked away. John's mind spun as he finished his shift that night. He returned to his modest apartment, a small, cluttered space filled with memories of his late wife and framed pictures of their only daughter, who had moved across the country to start her own family. The glow of a single lamp cast shadows on the walls as he sat down at his rickety kitchen table, papers and bills scattered before him. The realization that he was on the brink of exposing a scheme so monumental that it could either save or destroy lives kept him awake, until the early hours of the morning. Sleep was fleeting, haunted by images of disgraced employees and families left destitute. When dawn broke, John stood by his window, watching as the first rays of sunlight painted the city in hues of gold and crimson. Determination hardened his features. He might have been invisible, but he wasn't powerless. He decided then and there that he would gather evidence, even if it meant risking everything. The morning sun struggled to break through the clouded sky, casting a dim light over the city that matched John Parker's mood. He walked into Ellison and Company, his steps deliberate but heavy, every nerve on edge. The chatter of employees, the ringing of phones, and the occasional laughter echoed through the lobby, oblivious to the storm that was about to come their way. As he passed through the halls, mopping floors and emptying trash bins, John's eyes were constantly moving, watching, noting. The executives swept by in tailored suits, carrying the weight of their ambitions. Mark Ellison walked past him at one point, his expression a mask of confidence and charm. To the rest of the building, he was the face of success. To John, he was the embodiment of betrayal. During his lunch break, John sat at a table in the break room, alone, with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The familiar figure of Tom, the security guard, and one of the few people who acknowledged John's existence, approached him. Tom was a burly man with kind eyes and a ready laugh, but today his expression was serious. "John, you look like you've seen a ghost," Tom said, sitting across from him. His voice was low, his concern evident. John took a long sip of his coffee, letting the warmth steady him. "I wish it were just a ghost, Tom," he muttered, eyes flicking around to ensure no one else was listening. Leaning forward, he whispered, "I heard something last night. Something big. Mark Ellison is involved in a scheme to move company funds. It'll ruin people's lives if it goes through." Tom's brows shot up, the usual ease in his demeanor replaced by disbelief. "John, are you sure about this? We're talking about the vice president here. This could get you in serious trouble." "I know what I heard, Tom, and I need your help. If we can get access to some of the records, prove what he's doing, we can stop this before it's too late," John said, his voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside him. Tom sat back, crossing his arms, eyes narrowing as he considered the risk. "You realize they'll come after you if they find out, right? Mark isn't the type to let something like this slide." John nodded, the weight of Tom's words settling over him like a lead blanket. "I know, but I can't just do nothing. Too many people depend on this company for their future." A moment of silence passed between them, the reality sinking in. Finally, Tom sighed, a resigned smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All right, old man, you've got me in. I'll find a way to get you the records. But if this goes south, we're both going to need more than luck to get out of it." Over the next few days, the routine continued, but the air was thick with tension. John's eyes scanned every paper left on desks, every open folder in an office he happened to pass. He carried a small notebook in his pocket, where he scribbled notes in tiny, cramped handwriting. It was risky, but he knew it was the only way to piece together the puzzle that could save so many livelihoods. One evening, Tom managed to slip John a small stack of copied documents. "Here, financial reports from the last quarter. They're not complete, but there's enough here to show discrepancies," Tom whispered, glancing nervously down the corridor. The two men exchanged a brief nod before parting ways, each aware of the stakes they were playing for. In the quiet of his apartment, John spread the documents across his kitchen table. His hands shook as he went through them, the figures and lines confirming what he feared. Transfers to shell companies, vague project descriptions that didn't add up, and authorizations signed by Mark Ellison himself. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, but meticulously camouflaged by layers of legitimate business jargon. John leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as exhaustion and anxiety gnawed at him. A sudden knock at the door made him jump. sending a surge of adrenaline through his veins. He moved cautiously, peering through the peephole. Tom stood on the other side, his face drawn and serious. "We need to talk," Tom said when John opened the door. "Word is, Mark's been acting different. Someone must have tipped him off that something's going on. We're running out of time." John's heart sank. If Mark was already suspicious, it was only a matter of time before he tightened his grip on everyone involved. But instead of fear, a steely resolve settled over him. "Then we act now," he said, looking Tom in the eye. "Tomorrow, we go to Claire Bennett. She's the only one in that boardroom who might listen." Tom's expression shifted from worry to a faint smile of approval. "Let's hope she's as honest as we think she is." The next day dawned with an overcast sky, a thick blanket of clouds that seemed to reflect John's own apprehension. He walked into the building with Tom by his side, their steps measured, their faces set with determination. The plan was simple yet dangerous. Confront Claire Bennett with the evidence they had gathered and hope that she would be willing to act before Mark Ellison could make his next move. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like an eternity. The silence between John and Tom was heavy, punctuated only by the soft chime as each floor passed. When the doors slid open, the polished, glass-walled offices came into view, a stark contrast to the grim reality they were about to expose. Claire Bennett was at her desk, her eyes scanning a report. She looked up as John and Tom approached, surprise flickering across her features. She was known for her sharp intellect and strict adherence to ethical standards, traits that had earned her both respect and resentment among her peers. Tom, this is unexpected," she said, her voice calm but curious. John's hands clenched around the folder he was holding. "Ms. Bennett, we need to speak with you in private. It's urgent." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed their expressions. With a nod, she gestured for them to enter her office and closed the door behind them. The room was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the subtle hum of the city below. John took a breath, steadying himself. This was it. "Claire, last week, I overheard a conversation involving Mark Ellison," John began, his voice firm but low. He handed her the folder with the documents Tom had risked so much to obtain. "He's moving company funds, millions, away from pensions and benefits into shell accounts. If this goes through, thousands of employees will be left with nothing." Claire's face, usually composed and unreadable, shifted as she flipped through the pages. Shock turned to anger as she absorbed the details. She placed the papers down, her fingers drumming on the desk in rapid succession. This is worse than I thought," she muttered. "I knew something was off, but I had no idea it was this extensive." Tom stepped forward. "We need to act now, Claire. Mark's already suspicious. If he finds out we're onto him, he'll move faster, and this will all be for nothing." Claire's eyes met John's, searching for something. Trust, courage, perhaps both. Finally, she nodded. "We'll need more than just this. We need proof that can't be dismissed, a smoking gun." John felt a wave of frustration and determination wash over him. "We have until the board meeting tomorrow, don't we? That's when he plans to announce the new budget. If we don't stop him before then, it's over." A plan began to take shape, hurried and fraught with risk. John would gather the final piece of evidence, a crucial document he'd seen once while cleaning late at night in Mark's office. Claire promised to delay any last-minute moves by Mark while Tom would keep an eye on security to avoid raising suspicions. That night, as the building emptied and the city hummed with life outside, John found himself in the dimly lit hallway leading to Mark's office. The shadows seemed to shift around him, as if aware of the danger that lurked. With Tom stationed by the elevator, John took out the set of keys he'd borrowed, keys that granted him access to places a janitor was never supposed to go. The office was pristine, almost sterile, with walls adorned by certificates and framed photographs of Mark shaking hands with influential figures. John's eyes settled on the desk, its polished surface reflecting the city lights through the large window. He approached, his pulse hammering in his ears, and began to sift through drawers and files, searching for the final piece of evidence. Minutes ticked by, each second marked by the relentless ticking of the wall clock. Finally, his hand landed on a file labeled Contingency Plan. He flipped it open, eyes scanning the contents, approval signatures, transaction details, and communication records that linked Mark directly to the scheme. This was it. A noise from the hallway made John freeze. Voices, sharp, hurried footsteps. Panic surged through him as he stuffed the papers into his bag and closed the drawer. The office door handle turned, and for a split second, John's mind raced for an escape. But before the door could open, Tom's voice echoed from down the hall, calling out to someone, drawing them away. The voices faded, and John exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. He slipped out of the office, heart thundering, and nodded to Tom as they passed in silence. They both knew what tomorrow would bring, a confrontation that would either expose the truth or cost them everything. The next morning, the Ellison and Company boardroom buzzed with anticipation. The polished mahogany tables stretched across the room, lined with stern faces and crisp suits. Executives adjusted their ties, exchanged wary glances, and murmured among themselves as they prepared for the quarterly budget meeting. Mark Ellison stood at the head of the table, exuding confidence in his tailored suit, his eyes cold and calculating. Today, he planned to solidify his control. John Parker entered the room, not as the janitor invisible to all, but as a man with a purpose. Tom was stationed near the door, his face impassive, but a subtle nod passed between them. Claire Bennett sat near the end of the table, her expression a mask of calm that hid the storm of anticipation underneath. In her bag rested the evidence John had gathered, ready to be revealed at the right moment. The room fell silent as Mark cleared his throat and began. Ladies and gentlemen, as we go over this quarter's financial projections, I want to assure you that Ellison and Company continues to grow, even in these uncertain times. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that could sell anything. John's heart pounded as he stood in the corner, pretending to clean, but watching every move. His eyes met Claire's briefly, and she gave a barely perceptible nod. It was time. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and spoke up. "Excuse me, Mr. Ellison, but I need to say something." The room froze. Heads turned, eyes wide with confusion and shock. Executives whispered, some even chuckled in disbelief. A janitor speaking in a board meeting was unthinkable. Mark's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "John, this is neither the time nor place. Please step back," he said, a forced smile on his lips. But John stood firm, lifting the folder in his hand. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ellison, but this is exactly the time and place. The people in this room deserve to know what's really going on with their company's finances." Gasps rippled through the room. Claire rose from her chair, stepping forward to stand beside John. "He's telling the truth," she said, her voice strong. "We have evidence of unauthorized transfers and fraudulent activity involving company funds." Mark's face turned a deep red, his composure cracking. "This is preposterous," he barked, slamming his fist on the table. "I demand this be stopped immediately." But Claire had already opened the folder, spreading the documents across the table. "Here are the proof, signatures, transaction logs, and communications that tie you directly to the misappropriation of pension funds," she said, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. The room erupted in chaos. Executives stood up, voices overlapping in shock and disbelief. Some demanded explanations, while others stared at Mark with betrayal in their eyes. Mark's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, a lifeline. But there was none. He was cornered, and everyone knew it. Tom stepped forward, arms crossed, ready to intervene if Mark made any sudden move. The air was charged, the moment hanging by a thread. Mark's defiant eyes met John's, a flash of fury and disbelief. "You think you've won, Parker? This will destroy you too," he hissed. John met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe. But I'm not the one who stole from people who trusted me." The doors to the boardroom burst open, and a small group of journalists and media crews, led by Lisa Morales, entered, cameras rolling. The board members stared, frozen in place as flashes illuminated the room. Lisa stepped forward, her microphone aimed at Mark. "Mr. Ellison, do you have any comments on the allegations against you and the evidence presented today?" Mark's face was a mask of rage and panic. With nowhere left to run, he stood, chest heaving, before pushing past the journalists and storming out. The boardroom erupted into a frenzy of questions and accusations. The balance of power irreversibly shifted. Amid the chaos, John felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Claire. "You did it, John. We did it," she whispered, a rare smile breaking through her professional demeanor. For the first time, John felt seen, not just as the janitor, but as a man who had made a difference. The boardroom still buzzed with tension long after Mark Ellison stormed out. The executives sat in a stunned silence, trying to process the scandal that had just unfolded. Whispers grew louder as journalists pushed forward with their questions, cameras capturing every reaction, every flicker of shock and disbelief. John Parker stood at the center of it all, feeling the weight of what had just happened sink in. His pulse pounded in his ears as the voices around him became a blur. He had taken the first step into a storm that no one else dared to enter, but now the consequences loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon. Claire Bennett moved with the authority of someone who had been waiting for this moment. She raised her hand to quiet the room, her voice clear and unwavering. "Everyone, we need order. This company will not fall to chaos. We will address these allegations and take appropriate action." She glanced at John, a silent acknowledgement of his courage. Lisa Morales, the journalist who had covered some of the most contentious corporate stories in the city, stepped closer, her camera crew following her every move. "Mr. Parker," she called, her voice slicing through the noise. "What made you decide to come forward with this information, knowing the risks involved?" John's throat felt tight, but he met her gaze. "Because it was the right thing to do. People trust this company with their futures, and they deserve to know the truth. No position is too small to make a difference." Applause erupted from the far end of the room where a group of employees had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Their faces lit with admiration, their eyes fixed on John. He recognized some of them, workers he saw every day, who, like him, lived in the shadow of the company's grandeur. But today, those shadows seemed a little less oppressive. Outside the boardroom, the atmosphere was equally electric. News of Mark Ellison's actions spread like wildfire, sparking discussions from the lower floors to the executive offices. Some employees looked shocked, others relieved that the truth had come out. The building, once a fortress of secrets, now felt exposed, vulnerable. Tom found John amidst the commotion, a proud grin spreading across his face. "Well, you sure know how to shake things up, old friend," he said, clapping a strong hand on John's shoulder. The tension that had knotted John's chest loosened at the familiar comfort of his friend's voice. "Thanks, Tom. Couldn't have done it without you," John replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. He glanced back at the boardroom, where Claire was already on a call, no doubt with legal teams and auditors. The fight wasn't over, but the first victory was theirs. Suddenly, Claire's voice called out from behind, "John, Tom, a word in private." Her eyes were serious, determined. The two men exchanged a glance before following her to a smaller conference room down the hall. Claire closed the door behind them, the hum of the chaos outside muted to a distant echo. "We have to move fast," she said, spreading more documents on the table. "Mark has powerful connections, and he won't go down without a fight. This isn't just a scandal. It's a battle for control of the company." John felt the gravity of her words. He had thought that exposing Mark would be the end, but it was clear now that this was just the beginning. "What do we need to do?" he asked, the resolve in his voice unwavering. Claire's gaze softened slightly as she looked at him. "We're going to need to testify, bring in the employees who were affected, and involve the authorities. This has to be airtight. Are you ready for what's next?" John took a deep breath, the room feeling both too small and infinite at the same time. He nodded, a slight smile breaking through. "I didn't come this far to back down now." Tom chuckled, the tension lifting for a moment. "Looks like we're all in, then." The quiet determination in that room was a stark contrast to the storm outside, but it was enough. It was the kind of resolve that built movements, changed lives, and shifted the course of companies. The following days at Ellison & Company were marked by an intense mix of upheaval and resolve. The company, once a bastion of corporate prestige, was now under scrutiny from both internal and external forces. Auditors swarmed the offices, and whispers of betrayal and disbelief coursed through every department. John Parker, the once invisible janitor, found himself in the eye of the storm. Claire Bennett had taken immediate action, involving regulatory bodies and calling for an emergency review of all recent financial activities. She and John worked tirelessly, poring over documents and gathering testimonies from employees whose livelihoods were now at stake. Tom, always vigilant, provided support and kept an eye on any suspicious movements around the building. But the calm before the storm was short-lived. Mark Ellison, though disgraced, was far from defeated. His network of loyalists within the company remained intact, and rumors suggested he was planning to retaliate. John felt the tension building each day, as if the very walls of the building were pressing in. One afternoon, while John was reviewing a list of potential whistleblowers in a secluded corner of the office, Tom approached with a grave look. "John, you need to be careful. I overheard something in the security room. Mark's people are trying to find leverage. Anything to discredit you?" John's jaw tightened. He had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a shiver down his spine. "They can try," he said, determination stealing his voice. "But we have the truth on our side." The next day, John found an anonymous note slipped into his locker. "You think you're a hero, but heroes fall too." The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. It was a warning. He showed it to Claire, who pursed her lips and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We knew this would come. Stay vigilant. We're almost there." The tension reached a breaking point during the scheduled testimony with the board. John stood in the large, imposing room, where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, giving a view of the city that seemed more daunting than inspiring today. Claire was by his side, along with representatives from a third-party auditing firm. The members of the board, who had once regarded John as little more than a background figure, now watched him with a mixture of wariness and respect. The door swung open, and Mark Ellison walked in, flanked by two lawyers. He looked every bit the powerful executive he had once been, but his eyes betrayed a different story, one of desperation and defiance. He took his seat, leaning back, as if daring anyone to challenge him. "Let's proceed," said Claire, breaking the silence. John took a deep breath, every eye in the room fixed on him. "I came forward because I couldn't stand by while the people who depend on this company were betrayed. What we found proves that funds meant for pensions and benefits were misused to line the pockets of those who thought themselves untouchable." Mark's lawyer stood up, a slick man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue. "These allegations are baseless, coming from a janitor with no understanding of the complexities of corporate finance," he said, smirking. Tom, standing at the back of the room, shifted his weight, ready to react at a moment's notice. But John didn't falter. "What I know," he said, his voice steady, "is that trust is more valuable than any number on a ledger. And trust is what you stole." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft clicking of a pen as one of the board members leaned forward. "We need to see the full extent of the evidence," she said, eyes locked on Claire. Claire nodded, sliding the compiled report across the table. The board members flipped through the pages, faces turning from confusion to shock as the numbers told their story. Mark's defiance wavered, and for the first time, his eyes darted around the room, searching for support that was no longer there. Outside, as John stepped into the hallway, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, but it was met with a sense of relief. The lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back now. Mark Ellison's reign was crumbling, and for the first time, the people who had built the company with their sweat and trust had someone fighting for them. The tension in the building was palpable. The revelations that had come to light were sending shockwaves not just through Ellison and Company, but across the corporate world. News outlets picked up the story, and headlines screamed about the scandal involving a multimillion-dollar scheme, betrayal, and the unexpected hero, John Parker, the janitor turned whistleblower. Mark Ellison was no longer the untouchable figure he once was. Investigations were in full swing, and the board had convened a special session to determine his fate. John sat in the waiting area outside the boardroom, nerves coiled tight like a spring. Tom paced nearby, his broad shoulders tense with concern. Inside the boardroom, voices rose and fell in heated debate. Through the glass walls, John could see Claire Bennett standing firm, arguing for transparency and justice. Mark, on the other hand, sat with a grim look, flanked by his high-profile attorneys who spoke in controlled, authoritative tones. The battle was far from over, and John knew that today would be the tipping point. "John," Tom said, breaking the silence, "whatever happens in there, you did the right thing. Don't forget that." John nodded, his eyes meeting Tom's with gratitude. "I won't, and I won't let them forget it either." The door opened, and Claire stepped out, her expression serious but with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "It's time, John," she said. He stood, legs feeling like lead, but walked with the resolve that had carried him this far. As he entered the room, the murmurs died down, and all eyes turned toward him. Mark's glare was sharp, a predator cornered. His lawyers whispered among themselves, their confidence waning. The head of the board, an older man with a weary expression, cleared his throat. "Mr. Parker, we've reviewed the evidence you and Ms. Bennett provided. We need you to recount what led you to discover this information." John took a breath and began, recounting the late night he overheard Mark's plan, the fear that clutched his chest, and the choice to act despite knowing the risks. As he spoke, the room remained silent, each word sinking in deeper than the last. Faces that once looked at him with dismissive indifference now showed respect, and some even regret. When he finished, one of the board members looked at Mark. "Mr. Ellison, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Mark stood, a cold smile playing on his lips. "This is a witch hunt, plain and simple. You're taking the word of a janitor over years of proven leadership and success. It's absurd, but the room wasn't buying it. The weight of the evidence was too overwhelming, and the air crackled with the realization that Mark's era was over. His confident facade cracked as the head of the board spoke once more. "Given the severity of these accusations and the corroborating evidence, we have no choice but to suspend you pending further investigation." Mark's face paled, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the room. The decision was made, and the power he once wielded slipped from his grasp. He shot one last venomous look at John before storming out, flanked by his lawyers. The silence was replaced by a wave of whispers and murmurs. Claire turned to John, a rare smile breaking through her professional mask. "It's over," she said softly, but John knew it was just the beginning of healing and rebuilding. As he stepped out into the corridor, the gathered employees who had waited for news began to clap, the sound swelling until it echoed off the marble floors and glass walls. For a moment, John stood still, taking it all in. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, and for the first time in years, he felt truly seen. The days following Mark Ellison's suspension were a whirlwind of activity. Auditors combed through the company's financial records, finding more evidence of misappropriation than even John or Claire had anticipated. The company's name, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now a fixture on news broadcasts and headlines. But within the walls of Ellison and Company, a different kind of change was taking place. John Parker walked into the building with a renewed sense of purpose. The whispers that once dismissed him as just a janitor had turned into greetings of respect. Colleagues who had never acknowledged him now nodded in recognition, some even stopping to thank him for his courage. It felt surreal, yet gratifying. The years of being unseen, of quietly observing from the periphery, had led to this moment. Claire Bennett had taken temporary control of the company's operations and initiated sweeping reforms. Meetings were no longer shrouded in secrecy, and employees were encouraged to voice their concerns. The mood had shifted from one of suspicion and hierarchy to one of cautious hope. One afternoon, Claire called John to her office. The large windows flooded the room with light, a stark contrast to the tense meetings of the past. She gestured for him to sit, a smile softening her usually serious expression. "John, you've done more for this company than most ever could. We owe you a debt that can't be repaid with just words." John shifted in his seat, still not quite used to the attention. "I just did what I thought was right, Claire. For everyone who works here. For their families." She nodded, leaning forward. "Exactly. And that's why I want you to take on a new role here. We need someone who understands the company from the ground up, someone who can make sure this never happens again." She slid a folder across the desk. "I'd like you to be our ethics and compliance officer." John's eyes widened as he glanced at the offer. The weight of the title and what it meant sank in. This was more than just a promotion. It was a chance to be part of the change he had fought so hard for. He looked up at Claire, emotions swirling in his chest. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept," Claire said, her smile turning into a grin. "We need your voice, John. The company needs it." With a deep breath, John nodded. "I'll do it." The news of John's new position spread quickly, sparking applause and cheers throughout the building. The man who had once been invisible now stood as a pillar of integrity and hope. Tom found him later that day in the break room, the same place where their plan had started. He clapped John on the back, eyes gleaming with pride. "Look at you, Mr. Ethics Officer. Who would have thought?" John laughed, the sound coming freely. "Not me, that's for sure." They shared a moment of silent camaraderie, the kind that only comes from facing down giants together and coming out on the other side. As the sun set over the city that evening, John looked out from his new office, the view vast and filled with possibility. The fight hadn't been easy, and it had cost him sleepless nights and moments of doubt. But as he watched the skyline bathed in the warm glow of dusk, he felt something new: peace. The kind that comes from knowing that, no matter where you start, courage and conviction can take you to places you never dreamed possible. John Parker, the janitor who once roamed the halls unnoticed, was now a guardian of integrity, reminding everyone that doing the right thing was never a small act. It was and always would be the bravest one. Now that you've followed this story full of twists and emotions, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and share what you thought about the plot and which moment was your favorite or most gripping. Don't forget to leave a like. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss any new stories we share. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.